Hi everyone, welcome to AWS API Gateway Lambda Integration Types tutorial. I am Arogya Das. In this tutorial, we will learn about API Gateway REST API Lambda integration types, the differences between proxy and non-proxy Lambda integrations with a REST API, and the implementation methods for the Lambda integrations. Now, let's go into the contents. First, API with Lambda integration overview. Let's see briefly what is Lambda integration. Once the API and the resource are created, the API methods such as get, put, post, delete, and so on have to be created and integrated with a backend endpoint, and it is called as the API integration. The backend endpoint, also referred to as an integration endpoint, can be a Lambda function, HTTP web page, or an AWS service action. The API method has an integration request and an integration response. An integration request contains an HTTP request received by the backend. An integration response is an HTTP response which contains the output returned by the backend. There are two types of Lambda integrations for the REST API. One is Lambda-proxy integration and the other is Lambda-nonproxy integration or Lambda custom integration. Now, let's see what is Lambda-proxy integration. In Lambda-proxy integration, the API gateway forwards the entire request to the backend service, and the backend service processes the request and returns the response. In this type of integration, we need to only specify the integration type as the Lambda function, and the API gateway configures the integration request and integration response automatically, and we do not need to configure the integration request and the integration response manually. The input to the Lambda function can be expressed as any combination of request headers, path variables, query string parameters, body, and API configuration data. The main advantage of proxy integration is easy configuration and control over the request and response in the backend service. However, this approach limits our ability to manipulate the request and response from the backend service. Next, Lambda non-proxy integration. In Lambda non-proxy integration, the input to the Lambda function should be provided as the integration request payload. The API gateway lets us control how requests are transformed before they are sent to the backend and how responses are returned. Unlike proxy integration, in non-proxy integration, we need to configure the request and response mappings. The main advantage of Lambda non-proxy integration is we have control over the request and response structure, and it is useful when integrating with the backends that need specific formats of data. Next, prerequisites. For this tutorial, first you need to have an AWS account, and you can create a free tier account, and you can find account creation link in the description. Secondly, an IAM user with required privileges such as create API gateway, Lambda, and so on. As it is hard to spot out the specific privileges, for this tutorial, you can assign administrator access managed policy to the IAM user. Next, create and test API gateway. So, for this, from AWS console, we will create a Lambda function using Python language, which will act as the backend service for the API. The Python programs are available in my GitHub account, and I have given the GitHub URL in the description for Python code for both proxy and non-proxy integrations. We will create one Lambda function and use it for both proxy and non-proxy integration, but with a different code. Next, We will create REST API in AWS console, then create resource API Lambda integration and a post method which will be integrated with Lambda function. Same as Lambda function, we will create one API and use it for both proxy and non-proxy integration by setting the Lambda proxy integration setting to on or off. Next, deploy and test API. Before deploying the API, let's test it from the AWS console. Once it is successfully done, we will deploy the API to generate the URL and test it from the Postman. Now, let's log into AWS console and do the hands-on demo. I have signed into my AWS account and now let's create the Lambda function. So in the search box, type Lambda and select this Lambda service and it will navigate to the Lambda service screen. So here, click this create a function button and we will create a Lambda function from scratch. Here, let's enter the Lambda function name. Yes. And here for the runtime, I will select Python 3.13. And for the architecture, I will leave it as it is. And for the default execution rule, we will select this create a new role with the basic Lambda function. And what this role will do is, it will allow Lambda function to create log group and log stream and put the log events into the log group in the CloudWatch log. So for the additional configurations, I leave as it is and click this create function to create the Lambda function. This may take a few seconds and in the meanwhile, I will copy the Lambda program for the proxy integration which I have already created. Copy and come to the Lambda screen. So here, if you see, the Lambda function is created with a piece of default code. I will override this code and deploy the Lambda function. So I have already deployed the code. I have copied the code. Now I need to click this deploy button to reflect the changes. Click this deploy and you can see that deployment is successful. So now we have created the Lambda function successfully. Next, let's go to the API gateway service and create the API. For this, I have opened in another tab. In the search box, type API gateway and select this API gateway service. And for testing the proxy and non-proxy integration, we will use the REST API. Select this REST API and click this build button and we will create a new API. Here, give the API name test. And for the endpoint, I will select regional. So I have already created a video on API gateway and explained in detail all these API endpoints and all the features. So you can refer to that video or watch that video to learn more about the API gateway. So I will select this regional endpoint and click create API to create the API. Now the API has been created. Next, we need to create the resource. Click this resource button and I will give customer as my resource name and click the create resource. Now, as we have created the resource, next we need to create the method. So for this API gateway. For this, click this create method and here we need to select what type of method, what type of request we are going to send, whether it's going to be a get request or post request. put or anything as we want. For this tutorial, as we are going to test the proxy and non-proxy integration, I will go for the post method. That is, I will send the body request payload data from the API and check the difference between proxy and non-proxy integration. Here for the integration type, select lambda function. Next, for here is the main picture of our tutorial. So here for this lambda proxy integration, now it is set to false. That means it's a lambda proxy non-proxy integration. For this, click this button. So it is now it is enabled. It means we will use lambda proxy integration. Next, we will select the lambda function. So for this method, for the post method, which lambda function we want to invoke. Click this and it will show the list of lambda functions available. So here I have only one function. Here, select this function and the other details I will leave as it is. Now click this create method to create the method. As we can see, the API and the resource and the method have been created. Now this is the method request. So once we send the request, it will call this integration request and that will go to the lambda function, and once the lambda function process, it will return the response and the response will be returned to the client. So for this, if we click this integration request, we can see that lambda proxy integration is true. Now, as we have created the API, REST API, now let's test this API. For this, click this test button. Test. Here, we need to pass the query parameter, header, and the request body. So I have the JSON file for the proxy integration. Here, I will copy my JSON data and put it in the request body. For the query parameter, I will pass this one as the query parameter. Action equal to insert, and I will pass some custom header. Select this and paste it here. Now to call this post method, I am passing query string, query parameter as action equal to insert, and custom header as header test, key as custom header and value as header test, and the request body I have the JSON data, the data object which has customer and vehicle objects with this information. Now click this test button to invoke the lambda. So the lambda function has been successfully invoked and it has returned the response as status OK, message proxy integration processed, and the data has been sent as this. Now let's go to our lambda function and understand what it is. As you know, we sent the query string parameter, header, and the body. Also, I have created a detailed video on lambda function and it explains everything. Whatever we passed, the query string parameter, header, and the body, so everything has come as an event object. In the event contains all the data. If you see here, if this event contains query string parameters, then assign this query string parameter to query param and print this value. So this JSON.terms changes the query param into string. Next, if the event object contains headers, assign the headers to this and print it. Next, if the event object has body, then assign this body contents to payload. Then next, print the body contents, and here we are extracting the customer data from the payload data customer. If you see here the JSON data, so this is the request body which has been sent. So this data object contains customer and vehicle. That is what we are processing here. So customer data is passed to this one and vehicle data is assigned to this. Next, once this is processed, it sends the response as a status as OK and message as the proxy integration succeeded. So this response is returned to the client. So that's what this lambda function does. As I said, in the proxy integration, the entire request is sent as a event to the lambda function. That is the query string, header, body, everything together sent as an event object. Now let's go and see the CloudWatch log, how it is printed. So for this, click this monitor button, monitor tab, and click view CloudWatch logs. As we have invoked the lambda function from the API gateway, it has created the AWS Lambda API Lambda integration text. That is, the log group name is the same as the lambda function name. Next, this is the log stream. Click this and we will see the details. So if you see here, first we are printing the event. So it is printing, this is the event, the entire event object is printed here. Next, it prints query string, header and body, then each details. So here it prints the query parameter, header, then the whole body, then the customer detail, vehicle details. So as I have already explained, the event object contains the entire request. So that is all about the lambda proxy integration. Now let's go into the lambda non-proxy integration. So for this, we will not create a new function. We will modify the existing lambda function with the non-proxy integration code. So the code will be, it will be different for the non-proxy integration. So for this, I have the program here. So I will copy this code for the non-proxy integration and overwrite the code here. Okay, so as we will see the program details after executing the API. Click this deploy button to reflect the changes in the lambda function. Click this and we can see that deployment successful. Now we have deployed the Python code for the non-proxy integration. Next, we need to configure the API method to the lambda non-proxy integration. So for this, select this integration request and click this edit button. Here, this is lambda proxy integration has been enabled. Now let's disable this one so that it will be changed to lambda non-proxy integration. So toggling this button on or off, it changes from proxy to non-proxy and vice versa. Now we have enabled non-proxy integration. So I have changed. Now click save button. Okay. Now you can see here lambda proxy integration is set to false. Now let's test our lambda non-proxy integration. For this, okay, so our code has been already deployed. Now let's test it from here. For this, click this test tab, test button, and here I have a different file, JSON file for the lambda non-proxy integration. copy this data and paste it here. So the main difference, as we said, it is for non-proxy, the JSON data or the body will be sent as a whole. So we need to manually configure the query parameter, header, and the data part. Even if we send the query parameter or header here, it will not be considered. So that's why we need to pass all our query parameter, everything in the request body for the non-proxy integration. Now let's click the test button to invoke our Lambda non-proxy integration. Now also we can see that it has been successfully invoked. The status code is 2 and the message you can see that non-proxy integration processed. Now let's go to the Lambda function and understand the code, what it does. So for the proxy integration, the event object contained the request parameter, header, and the body. Here, the event object contains the request payload. It doesn't contain the header or the query string in the event object. Here, for the first, here I am printing the whole request event, the event object. Next, if you see in the JSON, the first request payload. That is what I am extracting here. Whether the event object contains the request payload object, and that is assigned to the payload. And next, the payload checking whether we are checking whether payload has the query param string key. If that key is there, then assign it to this and print the query param. Next, the same way we are checking for headers key and assign the details to this. Next, we check for the data object and get the customer data object and vehicle data details. Then print them, and here we formulate a response and send the response to the API gateway. So the difference, I hope you understood the difference between the proxy integration and the non-proxy integration. Now let's go to the CloudWatch log and check. So let's minimize, bring it to the normal mode and click this monitor button. Now click this CloudWatch logs and we can see that another log stream has been generated. So it is the latest one. Click this one and we can see that first we are printing the event object. So here I have printed the query param, headers, and the data part. So I hope you understood the difference between the proxy integration and the non-proxy integration. If so, for the theory part, you can refer to the explanation on the theory part. Now let us test this API from the Postman. So for this, let's go to the API gateway. Now for this API to be available to the client or the customer, we need to deploy this API and generate the URL. For this, click this deploy API button and we need to choose a stage. Click this stage. So I am telling dev. So description I will leave it as it is blank and click deploy. So now the API has been deployed, successfully created deployment for the API Lambda integration test API. Now click this dev stages and we will find the resource and the method. So now select this one and get this URL. So copy this URL and I have already Postman opened in my local. here select post as the method and enter the URL. Then for the to pass the request bodies, click this body and click raw data, and it will be showing us a JSON, and copy this JSON data, paste here and click the send button to test it. So we have tested our API from the Postman. We can see that our API has been called from Postman, and the API has called the Lambda function, and the response has been returned. The status code is 200 and non-proxy integration processed. Now let's go to the CloudWatch log and check the log stream. Click this one and click the refresh button. So it has returned the log data in the same log stream. If you see here, start and end. So we called twice this API non-proxy integration. One is the first time start and end, and next it has started from here and ended here. That is, this is the one which is called from the Postman. I hope you are now clear with the API gateway lambda proxy integration and non-proxy integration, the differences, and how to invoke them with the request payload and the required details. Now, as we have completed the API gateway REST API, lambda proxy and lambda non-proxy integration, now we need to delete or clean up the resources we have created so that we don't incur any unnecessary costs. For this, first let's delete the log group, next delete the execution roles, then the lambda function and the API. So click the lambda group. We can go to the log group itself and select these actions, delete log groups. So it will create the log group itself and the log streams inside it. We have deleted the log groups. Next, go to the lambda function, click the monitor button and click view CloudWatch logs to recheck or cross confirm that the log group is deleted. So it says log group does not exist. That means the log group has been successfully deleted. Next, go to the lambda function and click the configuration and click the permissions to delete the role which is created. Now here you can see the execution role. Click this one and it will take you to the IAM console where we will delete the role created for this. So you can see this AWS Lambda basic execution role which was created when we created the Lambda function. As I said, this role will allow Lambda function to create log group and log stream and put log events. Now let's delete this. Let's delete this role. And also for the API gateway, the same way, the API gateway also a new role is created. So delete that role also. This may take a few seconds. Okay, so the roles have been deleted. Now as we have deleted the log group and the execution role. Next, delete the lambda function itself. So go to the lambda function, select this and click actions, delete. So here enter, delete, and it will delete the lambda function. Okay, so click the lambda function and click functions. So we can see that no function is displayed now. Next, we need to delete the API. For this, go to the API gateway service, click this APIs and we will see the API here. Select this API and click delete. So here type confirm and click delete. Now the API has been deleted. So for this tutorial, so we have whatever resources we created, we have deleted so that we will not incur any unnecessary costs. That's all in this API Gateway REST API Lambda integration types tutorial. Thank you very much for your patience and time, and let's learn about DynamoDB in the next tutorial. Finally, a simple request, please like, subscribe and share to your friends if you found this video useful. Once again, thank you very much and see you in the next tutorial. Thank you.